So my name is Simon Nightingale. I'm the chair of Shropshire Humanists. And so welcome to this, the second of our 4 Tuesday evening events arranged by West Midland Humanist groups, including Birmingham, Coventry, Warwick, Ludlow in the Marches, Lichfield, Walsall, South Staffordshire, Warwickshire, and the best place in the West Midlands, which is Shropshire, where I am right now. So what we're going to do now is the same as what we did a week ago. I'm going to put you into breakout rooms for about 7 minutes to meet people, to chat with them. So introduce yourselves, talk about what's happening in humanism in your area, swap experiences, share ideas. And then, as I say, in about 7 minutes, I'll be returning you back to the main room. So I'll just organize that.
We're back.
We're back.
Good. Right. Well, I hope you enjoyed your little social get-together and met a few people you hadn't met before. Can I just mention that this event will be recorded? Now, it'll be mainly in a recording, what we call speaker view, so the person who's speaking rather than the whole gallery of people. But if you really don't want your face to appear on the recording, you can stop your video by clicking that little icon in the bottom left corner. You will still be able to see and hear everything, and you can always reactivate your video later if you want. So today we've got 2 short talks, the first on the psychology of climate denial, and the second on climate change and environmental ethics. We're hoping that the event will probably end about 9 o'clock. But first, I'd just like to bring you up to date with a development at Humanist UK. There can't be many humanists who aren't concerned about climate change, or more accurately, the climate crisis. Up to now, Humanist UK's response has been through their section called Humanists for a Better World. But it's clear for some time that we need a more specific response to the climate crisis. So Humanist Climate Action has been developed by humanists with a steering committee of which Richard Norman, the guest speaker today, and I are both members. Humanist Climate Action is to be launched officially in a few weeks' time. And I don't want to say too much to preempt that. But what I can say is that I can very strongly recommend it as an extremely helpful source for those of us who want to get our hands on the hard facts, and also very helpful suggestions about how we can actually make a difference, both practically and in a doable way, whether it's influencing MPs and councillors, demonstrations or protests, or getting the humanist viewpoint into the local or national media, and of course advice on how as individuals we can lead a greener lifestyle. Humanist Climate Action does not pretend to be an all-singing, all-dancing, standalone source for climate activism. And in fact, much of its helpful advice will be to encourage us to work with existing powerful organizations, of which there are many. For example, the Climate Coalition, various zero carbon and fossil fuel movements, Friends of the Earth, Greenpeace, Extinction Rebellion, ethical consumption, which is a favorite of mine. And also, if you're that way inclined, you can do what we've done in Shropshire, and that's helped to start up an interfaith climate action group as well. Now, there is one important aim of humanist climate action, and that is to challenge climate change ideas and beliefs that are irrational or not evidence-based, or worse, just deliberate disinformation. Which brings me to introduce our first speaker, Simon Nightingale, who has trained in psychiatry before becoming a clinical neurologist. Simon has a particular interest in cognitive neuroscience, neuropsychology, and neurophilosophy. Simon's going to talk about the psychology of climate denial. Now, I've told Simon to keep it short because, as you know only too well, he does go on a bit. Right. So I see there are a few people still joining us now. That's it, Holly is letting them in. So the psychology of those who push back against climate activism is a huge and complex subject. And this is a very short and simple account. It's just a taster to whet your appetite. Last year, before lockdown, I was in Shrewsbury Town Centre, just over there, handing out Extinction Rebellion leaflets about the imminent council climate emergency vote. Some people took a leaflet and sort of seemed interested. Some told me, don't worry, you're preaching to the converted. But the majority, about 80%, showed various degrees of hostility, denial, apathy, and skepticism. Now, those are all different categories, but in this short talk, I'm going to lump them all together and call them climate deniers, which isn't entirely accurate, but just for simplicity, I'm going to do that today. So what's going on with this 80% of people in Shropshire Town Centre? Well, look no further than here, okay? I would say that, my background in neuroscience. Everything we do, all our behaviours, all our experiences, our thoughts, our emotions, our illusion of consciousness, our delusion of free will, all of these things are due to electrochemical activity in here, our brain. Our brains have evolved many complex innate behaviours, hardwired, we're born with them, and then nurture, environment, and culture modify the gene expression. First, our brains are very good at identifying friends and enemies and people who cheat. Our brains are good at finding agency, cause and effect. In fact, we find agency often when there isn't any. That's the basis of superstition and probably the basis of many religions as well. Moral foundation theory has identified a group of moral behaviors that are innate: compassion, justice, respect for authority, in-group loyalty, and taboos. And as you would expect, these vary from person to person. They also occur in the higher animals, all of those moral behaviors. And of course, in the animals, it's almost entirely inherited, as they have virtually no culture. But our human brains are unique in the way we can anticipate the future. And of course, that's one of the reasons why we've created this extraordinary world. But our concern for the future is still pretty short term. Well, of course, none of that goes to explain the 80% in Shrewsbury Town Centre. Now, these innate attributes developed a long time ago and haven't altered much in the last few millennia. The main changes in the last few millennia has been culture. So these crude innate tendencies in our Stone Age brain, if you like, haven't altered much, okay? But now they're influenced by new information and ideas, memes that have huge psychological power, sociological power, and cultural power. So how does the Stone Age brain handle new information and new ideas? Psychologists like Daniel Kahneman, Amos Tversky, and Jonathan Haidt have shown two distinct information processing systems. Type 1, which is intuition, largely driven by emotions, particularly fear and anxiety. And type 2, slow thinking, called logical reasoning, which is indeed slow, and it is effortful. Bertrand Russell famously said, most people would rather die than think, and many of them do. So this is the important bit. This is the really important bit. The so-called logical reasoning isn't as logical or as reasonable as we like to think, because it's strongly affected by our intuitions and our emotions and by what is known as cognitive biases. And I'm going to come back to cognitive biases. So we humanists, we take pride in that we follow the evidence and we're rational. We believe that our views are based on type 2 thinking, logical reasoning, rather than intuition and emotion. And quite rightly, we present our views without any emotional colouring. And it's the same with climate scientists and climate activists. They see their role as providing factual information into a rational decision-based process. They believe the deniers just don't know enough yet. And this is referred to as the information deficit theory. Deniers are empty vessels. And of course, we all know that empty vessels make the most noise. All we need to do is to keep telling them the facts again and again and again until they agree. Now, there are, of course, deliberate disinformation campaigns, for example, by the fossil fuel industry and others motivated by greed. And it's absolutely right that we counter and correct false information. You know there's a but coming now. But research has shown that challenging other people's views with new information is seldom effective. And in fact, if anything, it reinforces these views. We know this from talking to our religious friends. The more you point out the lack of evidence and the irrational thinking, the stronger is their faith. It has to be. Surveys have shown that overall climate deniers have a slightly better general understanding of the science than climate change believers. So forget the empty vessel trope. Denial isn't due to lack of information. Okay, maybe climate deniers are just stupid. No, in fact, there's no correlation between views on climate change and intelligence. It's actually quite interesting that highly intelligent people are no more receptive to different views on climate change than people with an average or low IQ. The only difference is the intelligent people are better able to argue their case, whatever their existing view. So if deniers aren't ignorant or stupid, why are they so entrenched in their views? Well, our brain's logical reasoning, so-called, is undermined by cognitive biases. And unfortunately, we're largely unaware of them. Now, the classic, you all know this, is confirmation bias. This is where we tend to actively cherry pick evidence that supports our existing knowledge and beliefs. This is very well known to scientists, and we do try and guard against it. Biases produce schemas or mental maps, and we modify new information to fit in to our existing schema. This is called assimilation bias. We all do it. We all do assimilation bias. This confirms our good choice of a restaurant, the cleverness of our children, and proves we've been right all along. It's a natural human tendency. Okay, I'll give you an example. A climate activist and a climate denier go into a pub to discuss the weather. Well, okay. Psychologists did a study in which activists and deniers who'd experienced exactly the same weather conditions were asked. Now, the climate deniers saw the extreme weather as proof that weather can be naturally extreme. The climate activists saw the same extreme weather as evidence of increasing destabilization. And what's more, when they were asked to describe the weather, the same weather, the climate activist said it was rather warmer and the denier that it was cooler. In other words, the same information, the same weather experience is interpreted in the light of prior assumptions and prejudice. Okay, and then there's optimism bias. This is the way that smokers think that other people will get lung cancer. Drivers think that other people will have an accident. People think that the next big hurricane will hit somewhere else. Risk perception is full of cognitive biases. For example, people in North America, most people in North America and Europe, about 2/3, aren't particularly worried that climate change will affect them personally, though they do concede that it may affect other people, roughly in proportion to their distance from them. So what you find is that people aren't concerned about themselves and their families, their current families. We're okay. They're a bit more concerned about other local communities. There's a greater risk for Britain as a whole, a worse risk for people in poorer countries, even worse for non-human species, and worst of all risk for the most distant category of all, people in the future. That's how people tend to perceive the risk of climate change. Okay, but what about people who've actually experienced hurricanes and floods and fires, tragedies that are very likely to be due to climate change? Well, these disasters do have a huge reaction in the local community, and it's largely a commendable reaction. They pull together, they show unusual generosity and a shared sense of purpose. Again, you know there's a but coming. But they survived. And as you know, survivors tend to have a sense of future invulnerability. Also, because climate change is what happens to others, those who've been personally affected by, say, floods, are less likely to blame climate change than people considering those floods from a distance. And thirdly, the commendable community cohesion is directed towards returning to normal as things were before. They reinvest in normality. Surveys of damaged communities have shown remarkable reluctance at the time and later to consider climate change as an issue. An example is the survivors of Hurricane Sandy said, "From a practical point of view, we need to get back to normal. Climate change may have been a part, but we'll leave all that theoretical stuff until later." Later. As my kids used to say, a child need not be very clever to know that later, dear, means never. Okay, so all these cognitive biases make us resistant to changing our opinion on the facts alone. But how do people come by their opinions in the first place? This is the bit that climate scientists and humanists don't like. And there's sometimes a bit of pushback about what I'm going to tell you. You see, facts on their own don't do much. We really only understand facts and believe facts and act on facts if they're part of a story, what psychologists call a narrative. Stories perform an essential and fundamental cognitive function. They're the means by which our emotional brain makes sense of the information collected by the rational brain. We then base our decisions on the narrative fidelity rather than the quality of the information. The power of the story rather than the power of the plain facts. And unfortunately, when new information comes along, it somehow gets squeezed into the existing story, even if it's not consistent with it. This is the assimilation bias I talked about earlier. Our Stone Age brain needs a story with an enemy, a motive, and agency, cause and effect. So, a denier story might be that the governments, the bad guys, justify carbon taxes, the effect, in order to increase their control over our lives. Now that's the motives. That's a typical story of many American Republicans and right-wing Tories to justify their denial. Now, on the other hand, a good climate activist story might be right-wing oil billionaires, the bad guys, fund climate change denial, the effect, to increase their wealth. That's the motive. Now, that's a good emotional story. It certainly makes me very angry. Bland, unemotional facts can't compete with a compelling narrative. A good story is a lot easier to believe than a dozen graphs. You know, we humanists are very well aware that a religious narrative is, for many people, easier to believe and understand and follow than just rational evidence-based case. Here's an example. In the States, many Republicans and libertarians see climate activism as a bad thing. And that's because in the Republican story, climate activism has come from the political left. And we all know that left means socialism. And socialism is just another word for communism. And regardless of the issue, the left always proposes the same solution, which is more government control, more power for the technocratic elite, and a worse material standard of living for the ordinary good people. Every denier feels a hero, a little David against the Goliath of big government and corrupt environmentalism. A very compelling narrative. Okay, so deniers have a huge advantage when they, because they start by appealing to our emotional brain based on our values and concerns, and then they present selected evidence to support these emotional arguments. We don't stand a chance with our graphs and statistics. And statistics, you can prove anything with statistics. Okay, but why do we adopt one story rather than another in the first place? Well, it's got nothing to do with the quality of the information we get. It's to do with the cultural coding that comes with the information, what we call cultural cognition. Now, I believe information from people I trust, family, friends, and parts of the wider media that speak to my worldview and my values. The Guardian rather than the Daily Mail, George Monbiot rather than Trump. What we hear from our family and friends and those we regard as like us, our peers, has far more influence than the opinions of experts. In this way, we form what's called interpretive communities that are recognizable in the similar way they live, in what they think, whom they trust, where they get their information. So for climate issues, sociologists talk about homo credens. That's those convinced about climate change. And on the whole, most are middle-aged, college-educated, politically left of centre, and women, which is consistent with the observation that women are more responsive to risk, whether it's health or financial or climate. They also talk about homo negator, or the unconvinced, who are almost always strongly right of centre and from a more affluent and powerful social group. They're much more likely to be men and often have poor risk perception. This is an oft-quoted example. Middle-aged male motorbikers, 2/3 of them don't accept climate change. And this is interesting. Labour Party voters are twice as likely as Conservative Party voters to blame the same extreme weather on climate change. That's not because of their politics. It's because of different interpretive communities that I was describing earlier. And what's more, people not only identify strongly with their own community, but they also believe that their group has a special, distinct identity which makes it superior to other groups. Like the heroic right-wing David fighting the left-wing Goliath of deep state, democratic, paedophile lizard people. Okay, so let's come to the crunch. How do we motivate and mobilize people about climate change? Well, there are so many reasons why it's difficult. Climate change is complex, slow-moving, largely invisible, and has a rather uncertain future effect. And it has none of the immediate physical threats that really motivate our Stone Age brain. I've told you about cognitive biases that undermine our logical reasoning, confirmation bias, assimilation bias, optimism bias, and the biases of risk assessment, and there are many others. I've told you how we are groomed by our interpretive communities. I've told you about the huge power of a good emotional story with rubbish facts. And also, when predicting future climate, obviously there's an element of uncertainty, and that unfortunately plays into the hands of the deniers. You see, We humanists, like climate scientists, are skeptics, but in a good way. We challenge our own hypotheses. We don't claim to be 100% certain. I've always sort of hoped that our skepticism and our admission of uncertainty would be disarming and would increase people's trust. But sadly, it's often taken the other way. Now, you're familiar with these conversations. If neither of two theories are 100% certain, then it's a draw, and they're both equally valid. When somebody says, I'm entitled to my opinion, which of course is true, they then claim that means their opinion is as good as anyone else's. I'm sure you've come across this, sometimes surprisingly in intelligent people, but usually people who are unsophisticated in science, statistics, and philosophy, or are willfully disingenuous. One of the biggest obstacles to motivating people is that there's no actual identifiable enemy out there to bring us together and galvanize us into action. And what's more, when you think about it, we are actually the baddies, we are the enemy, and that's not something we like to hear. Well, maybe there are some baddies. I won't dwell on the effect of money and greed for the sake of my blood pressure, if nothing else. The fossil fuel industry is making so much money that they can effectively control governments and some of the media. They're a law unto themselves. So what's the bottom line? What have we got to do to sort out these deniers? I'm really sorry. I've run out of time. So I hope I've whetted your appetite and you're keen for more. If you'd like to learn more about this and discuss it, if you go to the top of the chat, my contact details are there. Get in touch and we will get together and discuss this further. Right. Okay, so it's now my great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Richard Norman, who for many years taught philosophy at the University of Kent, where he is now Emeritus Professor of Moral Philosophy. Richard is an active member of East Kent Humanists and a Vice President of Humanists UK, and was a founder member of the Humanist Philosophers Group, as well as the Humanist Peace Forum and Humanists for a Better World. As well as his numerous academic publications, he has written on a variety of humanist topics. Many of us first came across him from his book, On Humanism. There you go, On Humanism, generally considered to be one of the best introductions to humanism. With Richard's background in practical as well as theoretical aspects of moral and political philosophy, his interest in climate change and environmental ethics comes as no surprise. So I'll ask Richard now to unmute himself and to take over. He'll be answering questions at the end. And Holly, could you make sure everybody else is on mute?
And am I able to share screen in due course, Simon?
You are now.
Thank you very much. Okay, well, thank you very much for that introduction, Simon, and thank you to everybody, and great pleasure to, I was going to say to be here. Be here means something different on Zoom these days, but we should take advantage of it. I'm not just going to talk about climate change, partly because I think that the biodiversity crisis is just as urgent as the climate crisis. But the issues that I'm going to talk about really have to do with our concern for the natural environment generally. And the question I want to ask is, why should that be a concern? Why should we be concerned about the future of the natural environment and its protection? And in particular, why should it be a concern to humanists? Now, you may say that it's obvious that it should be Clearly, it's not obvious to 80% of Shrewsbury, but in present company, many of you may be inclined to say, well, of course, we should be concerned about it. Why complicate things? But both as a humanist and as a philosopher, I think it important sometimes to ask awkward questions, and that's what I want to do in this talk. And in particular, the question I want to raise is, can humanism specifically do justice to the reasons why we should be concerned about the natural environment? Because humanism is often described as being human-centered, anthropocentric, as people put it. Humanists themselves often say, for us as humanists, ethics is grounded in human well-being. And the question is that enough when we're thinking about the natural world? Now, clearly there are very strong human-centered reasons for protecting the natural environment. In the case of climate change, as we know, rising temperatures lead to extreme weather conditions, flooding, desertification, destruction of agricultural land and places where people live, which in turn is likely to lead to more mass migration, in turn leading to more conflict, and in general, likely to have pretty destructive effects on the lives of human beings. Likewise with biodiversity, people often point to the fact that diverse ecosystems are vital as natural resources for human beings. If we deprive ourselves of them, we deprive ourselves of possible sources of new medicines, new crop strains. Genetic diversity is important as an agricultural resource. Ecosystems are important as carbon sinks. Many of you may have seen the Dasgupta report, which came out last week, which argued the case for treating the natural world as a capital asset. Nature, it said, is our most precious asset. And again, people who are trying to argue the case for the importance of acting to preserve biodiversity often say what we need to draw our attention to is ecosystem services, the way in which ecosystems are of vital importance and vital use for human beings. So clearly that kind of case can be made. But the question I want to raise is, does the appeal to human interests, important as it is, does it adequately capture or fully capture the reasons why we ought to be concerned about the natural environment? Is human well-being enough? Consider this philosopher's thought experiment, sometimes referred to as the last humans. Suppose that a more deadly epidemic than that of COVID made it the case that existing human beings knew that they were the last generation on Earth, they were infertile, there would be no more human beings. Would it then become okay for them to say, okay, it doesn't matter what we do to the environment, it's okay now, we can burn down the forests, we can pollute the rivers and seas, we can trash the environment generally, because there will be no future humans to be harmed by it? Now that you may think that's obviously, as I say, what philosophers call a thought experiment, a rather silly example. Here's a more practical one. Take the case of the few remaining wilderness areas which have been completely untouched by human activity, primeval forests, for example. Is there a case for, as some people would say, preserving them on grounds that they are simply unique natural habitats and ecosystems, and will remain so only as long as there is absolutely no human intrusion on them? Well, that's an open question, but some people would say yes, and some people would say actually it's important to exclude any human intrusion on remaining wilderness areas, because it's important that there should be wilderness areas untouched by human activity. Well, that's a more complicated example, but it raises the question again. Are there things that matter besides human well-being? Now, one pretty plausible answer to that is yes. Apart from the well-being, the interests of human beings, there are other sentient beings, other living things, the higher animals, that can feel pleasure and pain. And the argument would go, if it's wrong to inflict pain and suffering on human beings, then surely it's wrong also to inflict suffering and pain on other animals who are capable of feeling pain and suffering. And that's an argument I think that humanists can readily accept as an extension of their conception of humanist ethics, and many do accept. And that's important. But it seems to me that it doesn't really get at the heart of our reasons for concern for the natural environment. It's much more relevant to ethical questions about our treatment of domesticated animals, farm animals in particular. It's important for making the case against factory farming, for example, and the terrible conditions in which cattle or chickens or pigs or whatever are often kept, and the terrible suffering that's inflicted on them. And many people, including many humanists, see that as an ethical case for vegetarianism. So clearly there's a case for extending a humanist ethic to take account of the interests of non-human animals who are sentient beings. But I don't think that that's the whole story in relation to the natural environment. Indeed, environmental protection may often involve and require the sacrificing of some other living things. Take the case of deer culling, for example. The fact that the Scottish Highlands are at risk of being severely damaged by the number of deer there. The Scottish government just last year produced a report saying that there needed to be more deer culling because of, as it said, the significant damage to the landscape of the Scottish Highlands because of the number of deer and the way in which the grazing habits of deer prevent trees and shrubs from naturally regenerating. So appealing to the interests of other animals, other sentient beings, doesn't, I think, take us to the heart of the nature of ethical concern about the natural world itself. So the question is then, are there reasons for protecting the natural environment other than human interests and other than the interests of other sentient beings, the higher animals? Should we protect the natural world for its own sake? Well, one thought that might well occur to people at this point is, well, yes, because the natural world just is lovely, it's beautiful, and it's that beauty that we should be striving to preserve and protect. What are we saying there exactly? Are we referring to the fact that we enjoy the beauty of the natural world, that we love going for walks in the country, the beautiful hills and valleys and rivers and so on? That again would actually be an appeal to human interest of a less obviously narrow kind, but nevertheless an appeal to human interests. And again, it would raise the question, how could that be a reason for preserving areas of the natural environment where human beings never actually go, where they don't, most human beings don't go to enjoy and to admire the beauty? So again, the question will be, should we preserve natural environments and the natural world in some strong sense for its own sake? In the philosophical literature on environmental ethics, you often get a reference to a distinction that people make between what they call instrumental value, value as a means to an end, value in respect of serving certain kinds of interests, and what they call intrinsic value. Something has intrinsic value if it's right that it should exist simply for its own sake, irrespective of any advantages or benefits that it might accrue to human beings or to anybody else. So many environmental ethicists explicitly say they're being critical of humanism here. They say the value of the natural world is quite apart from its instrumental value, it has intrinsic value, quite separate from its value for human well-being and human interests. Does it make sense then to talk about the natural world as having intrinsic value? I want to treat that as a genuinely open question So I'm not going to do quite the cliffhanger that Simon presented us with just now. I do want to say a little bit more about it, but I do want to see it as a genuinely open question. Can the natural world, does the natural world have intrinsic value? And I want to look now at some possible candidates for the reasons for thinking that it does. First of all, particularly if we're thinking about the case of biodiversity and a concern about species loss, the worry that more and more species are endangered and likely to become extinct, we might want to say, and some people will want to say, so species have an intrinsic value. It's right that species should be protected simply for their own sake. The number of endangered species is increasing, as we know. Should they be preserved for their own sake? Okay, so this is from Countryfile. Some examples of species in this country which are in danger of disappearing altogether. Turtle dove. Well, you might say, yes, of course, it would be terrible if there were no more turtle doves. Beautiful bird with a lovely song. Terrible if they were to disappear. Cosnar's net-winged beetle, which I'd never heard of before. Would it matter if that species died out, if there were no more Cosnard's net-winged beetles? Some other examples. Scroll down a bit. Hedgehogs. Well, it'd be terrible if hedgehogs disappeared, people might say. How cute. Fancy if a world where there were no more hedgehogs. Red squirrels. Ah, lovely. So when we talk about the threat of endangered species, we tend to think about the cute and the cuddly. But does it really matter if some species, like Cosnard's beetle, no longer existed? What exactly would be the loss? Well, I put that as an open question, but it's not entirely clear that it makes sense to say every disappearance of every species would be a loss. Maybe it would, and I'd like to know in due course what you think about this. One thing to bear in mind is that unlike individual living things, species cannot be harmed. Species can't suffer. It makes no sense to say that they do. It makes no sense, therefore, to say that we wrong species if we eliminate them in the way that it's wrong to inflict suffering on individual living things. So there's a question then. Do species have intrinsic value? Now, people concerned about biodiversity might say something else at this point. They may say, well, what's important is not individual species, but their place in complex, delicately balanced, fragile ecosystems. And of course, it's right. And we've increasingly learned how important it is to recognize the interconnectedness of ecosystems. You can't wipe out inconvenient pests without upsetting the balance of nature. Thinking of the classic example of Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring. If the farmers get rid of all the bugs, then there's nothing for the birds to eat, and so there are no more songbirds, and so you get silent springs. But again, the question to be asked is, do ecosystems have intrinsic value? Some people, so-called deep ecologists, say yes, every ecosystem has to be preserved just because it is a complex, interconnected ecosystem. Does that make sense? Is it convincing? Here's a practical example to think about. Take the case of HS2, you know, the new high-speed line from London up to your neck of the woods, you guys, and the fact that constructing it involves getting rid of a large number of areas of ancient woodland. And people who are campaigning against HS2 say these are unique ecosystems. Ancient woodland has existed for centuries. The centuries of undisturbed soil and decaying wood have nurtured unique communities of fungi and invertebrates. And it would be wrong to destroy those unique systems, those unique ecosystems. Why? If people want to say that, I don't think it's just a matter of ecosystem services, is it? It's not at all clear what the value of those ancient woodlands is in terms of, you know, say sources of rare medicines or whatever. if you want to say, well, but people enjoy walking in them, people enjoy the beauty of the ancient woodlands. Okay, that's important. But then if that's the reason for preserving them, couldn't that, at least in principle, be outweighed by the advantages to travellers of having a quicker and more comfortable way of getting from London to Birmingham, or indeed Birmingham to London? So if you simply look at the instrumental value of preserving ancient woodlands rather than driving a high-speed line through them, it's not clear that you've exactly captured what it is about ancient woodlands that people think is important to preserve. So again, we're back to the question, do we want to say we should preserve them for their own sake? Do we want to say they have intrinsic value? Well, I don't know what to say, but part of my hesitation is that it's not entirely clear to me what it means to say that woodlands or anything like that have intrinsic value completely unrelated to human lives and human concerns. So here's the final suggestion in conclusion. Think about the example of HS2 and ancient woodlands. Surely one of the important things about them is that they're ancient. Ancient woodlands are things that endure. They transcend our own individual lifespans. Those woods have been the background against which innumerable generations of human beings have lived out their lives. And so thinking about our relationship to an ancient woodland, we, on the one hand, have a sense of humility, a sense of the limitations of our own individual lives, which are put into perspective. But also we have a sense of continuity over time, that our own lives are part of that larger cycle of nature. The ancient woodlands were there before us, and perhaps we want them to outlast us. And I think that something of the same sort perhaps could be said about our relationship to the natural environment in general. What's important about it is perhaps that it is a relationship to something larger than ourselves, something within which we belong. It's something more than us, something other than us. It's the non-human world, but it's also our home, and our relation to it, our being a part of the natural world and intimately related to it as something other than ourselves, is one of the things that gives meaning to our lives. Maybe, thinking about what Simon said, maybe that's a story, and maybe it's the story that we want when thinking about why we should value the natural world. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Very much indeed, Richard. I'm clapping, and I'm sure everybody else is clapping silently as well. That was a wonderful, wonderful account. Now, what I'm going to do now is actually going to put everybody back into breakout rooms for about 5 or 6 minutes, and I want each breakout room to delegate a scribe at the beginning, and then to think of a good question to ask you. So, Richard, why don't you take Peter Bottom as one? Surely it's arrogance that leads us to believe we can decide. Why don't you talk about that?
Well, I think it is, but I think also, to say it's arrogance begs certain questions, doesn't it? To say it's arrogance implies that the things that we're arrogant about have a standing in their own right. I mean, people often say to suppose that the world is just there for our use is a kind of human arrogance. But if it were true that the world is there simply for our use, morally speaking, then it wouldn't be arrogance. So that's what I mean by question begging. I mean, I think that's right, but to say that it's arrogant is already to imply that putting humans on a special, giving humans a special status, as it were, putting humans on a pedestal, is unacceptable. So,
okay.
I guess my answer is yes, it is a question of arrogance, but that we need to say something more about what makes it count as arrogance.
There are several questions on a theme, and that is, how important is it for the human species to continue, and would it have been better if humans had never existed? Of course, it makes the question better for whom, but would you like to answer that?
Well, it does. It begs the question, better for whom? Yeah. I mean, I think as a, although I don't want to subscribe to the view that I was raising critical questions about, that the only value is instrumental value for human beings. I am puzzled by the idea that it would have been better if there had never been humans, because I think that the notion of value only makes sense as value to someone who values the thing in question. So that's not necessarily instrumental value. It's not necessarily value in the sense of being something you can use and adapt to your interests. But value, value must be, I think, if the word makes any sense at all, value for someone. I mean, if we said it would be better if human beings had never existed, we'd have to say something like, well, it would be better for the universe. But what does that mean? I suppose you could argue it might be better for other living things if humans had never existed. And that's a possible position, I guess. I suppose, come to think of it, I mean, there's something to be said for it, but you'd have to gloss it in that kind of way, I think.
Okay, so I've got another question, interesting questions from Lawrence Kinnersley, a very keen environmentalist in Shropshire. It's been suggested that it doesn't make sense to say that nature, natural systems, species, etc., have an intrinsic value, as this would make nature itself amoral, i.e., these things are destroyed by forces other than humans. What are your thoughts about that?
Could you are we able to put that up again so everybody can see it? Or
it has been suggested that it doesn't make sense to say that nature, natural systems, species, etc., have an intrinsic value, as this would make nature itself amoral, i.e., these things are destroyed by forces other than humans. What are your thoughts on that?
I'm not sure why it would make nature itself amoral. Depends what you mean by it. I mean, in an important sense, I guess nature is amoral. As far as we know, humans are the only species that make moral judgments, that make moral evaluations. Slightly debatable. I mean, when people talk about the evolutionary origins of human moral sensitivity and moral awareness, they talk about the capacity of some of the higher apes to show cooperation, solidarity, compassion, and so on. But I think one would have to say that's not yet fully fledged moral thinking. It's distinctive of moral thinking that you can give reasons for, that you're not just acting on spontaneous compassion, but have developed that into principles and values. So I would say that there is a sense in which nature is amoral. But then, I mean, I don't think that goes either way on the question of intrinsic value. The fact that nature, I mean, people sometimes say, well, why should we be concerned about the well-being of other species, because they just destroy one another without any moral compunction. But the fact is that we are moral beings, therefore we can be, from a moral point of view, concerned about the well-being of other animals, even though they themselves have no moral perspective on it. So I think the fact that even if you do want to say nature is amoral, I think that again leaves open the question of whether it has intrinsic value. It could have intrinsic value, whether or not other species had any kind of moral awareness. That's, I'm not giving very direct answers because I think this is a murky area.
Well, I don't think these people are alone in having trouble understanding the meaning of intrinsic value.
Well, no, that's right.
As opposed to nature. I mean, I understand it in other senses. Let me ask this question from Tag in Coventry. The planet is as it is. It is neither in crisis nor in paradise, except insofar as we attach that meaning to it. Value
Right.
is a human concept. It is
Yes.
not a feature of planet Earth. The planet will slough us off when it can no longer sustain us, surely.
I think I want to go along with that phrase, attach meaning to it. I mean, I do want to say, and this links up with what we were saying earlier about value always being value from a point of view. And that's why it makes no sense to say that it would have been better if humans had never existed. From what point of view can one say that? So yes, I do want to say, talk about the planet being in crisis, talk about the importance of concern for the planet or for the natural world or whatever, makes sense only insofar as we attach meaning to it. But what I guess it was that notion of attaching meaning to things that I wanted to try to spell out at the end of what I was saying. I cut it off a bit short, actually, partly because I wanted to bring in the remark about stories to link it up with Simon's talk, but also I was going to say something about the meaning that we give to the natural world is perhaps an important way of looking at why it has value for us. But it seems to me that that cuts across that distinction that I was talking about between instrumental value and intrinsic value. I don't find either of those two options entirely satisfactory. To say that the value of the natural world is just instrumental value for us, I've tried to give reasons as to why that's not entirely satisfactory. But I don't find the notion of intrinsic value, which seems to mean value irrespective of being value for anybody. I don't find the notion of intrinsic value very helpful either. Now you might say, well, why did I introduce it then? And the reason why I introduced it is that, as I said, in a lot of the literature, a lot of the writing on environmental ethics, that distinction is given a lot of intention and plays a very big part. Environmental ethicists pose that question, instrumental value or intrinsic value, very, very often. And I guess my own position, as far as I have one, is that I don't find that a satisfactory dichotomy. All right. I think that, that neither of those terms gets us to what we want to say about concern for the natural world. And that notion of attaching meaning to the natural world is valuable because of the meaning that it has for us, is helpful and useful and important, I think. Now, that's not to turn it into instrumental value. It's not to say we should protect the natural world because it gives meaning to our lives and we want our lives to have meaning. It is, what it is to say, if we want to give an adequate account of why we value the natural world, then we need to talk about the meaning that it has for us. And that would lead me into saying the sorts of things that I was saying about ancient woodlands. The meaning that they have for us is in part the sense that that ancient woodlands are ancient, that they endure beyond our own individual lives. And a key question for humanists generally, I think, is people sometimes say to humanists, oh, well, if you think that it all ends in death, what's the point of anything? And to answer that question, humanists, I think, need to talk about why things matter to us beyond our own individual lifespans. Now, in part, that involves talking about our place within an ongoing human story, our relationship to previous human beings, previous generations, and our obligations to future generations, seeing ourselves as part of an ongoing story larger than our own individual lives. But I think one can also say something comparable about our relationship to the natural world, that the meaning that it has for us is in part the meaning that it has as something that transcends our own individual lives, something that continues, of which we are a part. At humanist funeral ceremonies, people often talk about returning to nature. And I think for many people, that idea that in being cremated or buried, one is, we are part of the natural world and we're just returning to nature and become part of that ongoing natural world. That has a real meaning for some people, I think, a real resonance. And I think that something of that is perhaps what we need to link up to moral questions about our concern for the natural environment.
That's a very interesting response. Thank you very much. There are several more comments about human beings not being the best. My good friend Nick Marshall, who is an anarcho-humanist, he says humans are rogue species and wonders whether the total good would be increased by the removal of humans. I'm not sure who he's planning to start with. So somebody asked, you seem to be suggesting that we should all become vegans. Is that your position, or is there a way that humans can responsibly continue to produce and eat meat and fish and so on? Are you a vegetarian, Richard?
No, I'm not. I'd like to know what you think about this, actually, Simon, because am I right in thinking you are a vegetarian, Simon?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think it is unconscionable to eat beef, and everybody should cut down on the dairy produce. There you are. It's provocative.
Right. Okay.
And that's for climate reasons. And I don't eat animals that I believe have suffered.
No, right. I mean, there are two prongs to this argument, aren't there? There's, and that's why, you know, I talked about the interests of sentient beings. On the one hand, there are arguments for vegetarianism, which focus on the way in which the animals whose flesh we eat are farmed. And as I said, and as we all know, often terrible. You know, factory farmed chickens, the way that most pigs are kept is in incredibly cramped conditions. Some people, Peter Singer, for example, who is a humanist and is well known for a lot of stuff that he's written about making the case for vegetarianism, he makes it on grounds of animal sentience and animal suffering. And he says, partly because I think a lot of his writing was done when he was living in America, in eating meat, you can never be certain that it isn't meat that's come from animals kept in terrible conditions. And so to be on the safe side, you should never eat meat at all. I'm not totally convinced by that. It seems to me, you know, eating free range chicken is something that I do. Free range lamb, obviously.
I'm sorry, I must correct you. Free range chickens suffer horribly. They still clip their beaks, and they're just kept in slightly larger cages. Organic chicken.
Organic, okay, yeah, organic free range.
That is slightly better.
Okay, yeah, okay. I mean, clearly, you know, from that line of argument, it comes down to an argument about the facts about how exactly they're treated and what the nature of the farming conditions are. Now, as we've indicated, you know, there are also arguments, of course, for vegetarianism on grounds of action to prevent climate change or mitigate climate change. Again, there's a strong case there. It has to do with, well, partly animal emissions, not but methane emissions from animals and the way in which they, add to global warming. But also another dimension of it, and again, you probably know more about this than I do, Simon, almost certainly. The land on which animals are kept, grazing land, for example, would it act more effectively as a carbon sink if it were not used for grazing? Or some people would argue the contrary, that for example, upland pastures, the reason why they're preserved is in part because of their use as grazing land, and they therefore act as important absorbers of carbon emissions. So again, there are factual questions there. I mean, my own position is we've certainly cut down on our meat consumption, but I'm not a vegetarian. But as I say, I mean, I think the essential considerations here are the factual ones about what exactly the consequences either way are. But do you want to come back on that, Simon?
No, I think the issue is self-evident.
What was that? Sorry, I missed that.
I think it's pretty self-evident, really. I mean, the case against beef is absolutely massive in terms of climate change, and we should try and cut down on dairy as well. Other
Yeah.
animals, in terms of climate,
Yeah.
aren't quite so bad.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Well, that's what I do. I cut down on dairy and I avoid beef.
Yes. Well, I think
Healthy meat.
we're coming up to about 9 o'clock now, and I think we'll draw this evening to a close while we're on a high note. Zoom meetings that go on beyond an hour and a half to start becoming a little bit tiring. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to thank Richard very much indeed for coming all the way from London through the cold and the snow and the sleet and presenting his wonderful talk. I might say that he has been talking about climate change and environmental ethics, but actually it is a huge subject. I mean, he sometimes runs courses, 6-week courses, and that's just an introduction to the subject. So his attempt to cover even the small area he has today in 20 minutes is a very impressive endeavor, and we're very grateful to him. And I've been trying to persuade him, perhaps I can do this in front of everybody else, to maybe run a small introduction to climate change and environmental ethics online sometime. And if any of you would like him to do that, get in touch with me and I will.
You'll do the arm
lean on
twisting, will
him.
you, Brett?
And if any of you interested in the psychological side of the issues to do with climate change, get in touch with me. I mean, I'm not an expert. I mean, I have great interest in this area, but it would be interesting to get together and discuss this more. So there you are. So I'd like to thank everybody. Thank you all very much for coming. I'd also like to just give a brief word about what's happening in a week's time. Now, in a week's time, we have a meeting called Humanism in Action. Now, many of you joined your humanist organizations because you like to be with like-minded people and discuss things like that. But the majority of you don't do humanism. But there are people who do humanism. These are people who go into schools, school speakers, celebrants for funerals, weddings, and baby namings, pastoral care, the equivalent of humanist chaplains, going into hospitals, hospices and prisons and in the armed forces as well. People involved in dialogue, in which people are gathering with people of other faiths to try and develop a rapprochement. And was there another one? I think I mentioned 5. Okay, so we're going to talk about those next week. Going to be a short presentation on each of those, and I'm hoping that we can actually encourage some of you to think about doing a bit more, to actually walk the walk rather than just talk the talk. And I would say that all of those of us who do this have never regretted it. It is not only important work, it is worthwhile, very fulfilling, and very enjoyable. So we're hoping that we can persuade some of you to come and join us. So again, thank you to Richard, and thank you all for coming. And I hope I'll see you all in a week's time. Keep in touch and keep safe.